I'm talking today with Gregg Hurwitz, resident of Los Angeles, California, former student of mine from Harvard, and someone I've known for a long time. Gregg's a novelist, and although he has very many other occupations, which we'll talk about today, it's a pleasure to see you, Gregg. It's been a while since we talked.
Good to see you too, Jordan.
Maybe we could start by you just outlining some of the things that you do, and then I think we'll focus on the political stuff more today. Not necessarily from a political perspective, though.
Well, I came in from novels. I'm a novelist. I write the Orphan X series. And I've also worked in screenplays and TV and comics and some other stuff. And I started to get involved in politics around 2016, in large part because before that, I kind of thought democracy would be fine without me. I didn't really feel any responsibilities as a citizen. I kind of had a lot of opinions, but didn't do a whole lot about it. And one of the things that I wanted to do when Donald Trump was elected, he was not a candidate or a president to my liking or who was a match with my value set. And the first thing that I asked myself, it's funny, you give that lecture about the Old Testament, that one of the answers that Old Testament answers is always like, God's angry, we screwed up. And so I really took that approach all the way down. I thought rather than starting to go on offense and tackle people who voted or thought differently than me or had different ideologies, I would try and think about the failings of the Democratic Party, the status quo, all the parts of society that I was part of, and how badly we would have to have fallen short for him to be seen as a viable and preferable alternative to the candidate that we were putting forth. And so I started to work with a lot of candidates. I was mostly interested in candidates in purple districts, talking to red voters, right? And so for the midterms, we work with 30 candidates, Democrat, in deep red districts, talking about making good faith arguments the way it's supposed to be, right? I have an opinion. I have a preference in political party to make good faith arguments to people to try and win them over to a different point of view. And we had a lot of success. I'd say that the 30 candidates that we work with, 21 won in terms of flipping those seats.
Well, all have foreign viewers here. So when you talk about deep red states, deep blue states, purple states, what do you mean?
Republican versus Democrat, right? I wasn't interested in figuring out I'm not interested in any conversations that take place in the bubble, of like-minded people. So I was interested in races in Oklahoma and New Mexico and Ohio and, Virginia. And so we really went there. And long story short, off that, I wrote a bunch of op-eds. I wrote one with you for the Wall Street Journal. And I did a lot for the Bulwark, trying to talk across the aisle. And I went out and talked to, I think, about a 360-degree arc of Americans, whether it was military, evangelicals, Black Lives Matter, Hispanic, Texas Mexicans, different population than, Miami Cubans, right? Different population from California Mexicans, and really talking to different groups and listening and figuring it out. And I wound up doing about 200 digital and television commercials. All this political work is pro bono with a small team of us here.
Yeah. Do you want to describe the team?
Yeah, it's me. It's Marshall Herskovitz, who's a TV showrunner and creator. He created 30-something. Billy Ray, Oscar-nominated screenwriter. He wrote, Captain Phillips. He just did The Comey Rule. Sean Ryan, the creator of The Shield, a TV producer, and Lita Kalogridis. She, has a ton of credits from Shutter Island to, she worked on Avatar and wrote a good amount of that with James Cameron. And what was interesting was in terms of the Hollywood system, after Trump was elected, I think the Democrats were humbled, and then they're always kind of willing to meet with Hollywoody people. But the washout rate was there weren't a lot of people who were interested in having different kinds of conversations. And I decided if I could actually get in front of Democratic leadership, and Marshall too was on that first trip with me, that I would say exactly what I thought all the time to the best of my ability.
So let me walk through this. So a couple of years ago, maybe that was in 2016 about,
yep,
you had some political awakening, let's say, and I guess that was attendant on Trump's election. Mm-hmm. And your response to that was, how did the Democrats sink so low as to allow this to happen? Is that a reasonable way of summarizing it? Rather than what the hell's wrong with all those Trump voters?
Yeah. And let me start to explore in earnest my confirmation biases and blind spots and talk to everybody who has a different perspective or point of view than me in earnest to try to figure that out.
Yeah. Well, and you guys decided that you were going to produce messages for the Democrat Party.
Yeah. And and
to do that on your own accord in some sense, or on your own dollar, but also independently.
Yeah, I mean, the line we used was, and I remember sitting in my living room talking about this. I said, we ask for no money, no credit, and no permission. And you said to me, that's exactly what Orphan X does. My protagonist of my thriller series. It was this really funny confluence of my political life and the things that I was writing in the fiction world. And what we realized is we couldn't go through everything we did was on our own. We raised our own money. One of the things we realized is the cost of admission for getting through messaging that I thought was making good faith persuasion arguments, but also that was fair. Every single economic fact that I put in any of the 200 commercials that I produced, I ran through a friend of mine who's like a Wall Street Republican. Like I always wanted opposition fact testing. We tried to do nothing fair that wasn't fair. I'm not suggesting we got this right all the time, but I tried to I didn't want ads that went after Trump's kids in certain ways that were off bounds and personal. I was trying, because look, if you're messaging and making propaganda is really what it is, that's Goebbels. You're in Goebbels' arena. That's dangerous stuff. You got to take it really, really seriously to try to engage and make arguments without getting corrupted by what that is in the
well, that's why it's dangerous, is that you don't understand. People don't understand when they start to mess with the truth, that they're starting to mess with their own psyches. Because if you start playing in the domain of deceit, you'll get tangled up in that so fast it'll make your head spin. And then you undo yourself. I mean, you can undo yourself even if you stick pretty close to the truth. Okay, so, I mean, what happened, what you guys did and the way you went about it has struck me as quite, I don't know, unbelievable, I guess. And that's why I want to dwell on it a bit. So you decided that you had a political responsibility. You organized yourself with a group of people, a group that was much larger to begin with, but that shrank quickly to those that were actually dedicated over some long period of time to putting a lot of work into this. And it's not surprising you got a bunch of attrition as a consequence of that. Then you decided that you would make messages that were in alignment with at least in principle, with the Democratic Party. But you didn't get permission from the party brass, so to speak, to do that. You did that independently.
Well, there's two things about the attrition rate. One of them was I quickly discovered that a lot of people who are interested in the sort of loudest online outrage are equally devoted to the status quo as the opposition. And so one of the things I came to very quickly was it matters much more important than language policing, right? And permission structures of who's allowed to say what, is an orientation on people's intentions and the actual outcomes. And that's one way you can assess the groups of people of whether someone's going to be useful. If you roll up your sleeves and actually get something done, whether that's winning a race in Oklahoma, right? Or trying to talk in good faith and respectfully to voters in Western Pennsylvania, it's going to be messy. You have to, there's no.
Okay, describe that. What do you mean messy? Like, what's messy about it? We've talked a little bit about the psychological consequences of this kind of action, even these kinds of discussions.
By messy, I mean good, meaning the further along I get with this, the more convinced I am that you cannot have a perfect conversation where everyone is contained and all the language goes seamlessly about race, about gender, and about class in America. And so when there's too much constriction around language from the left and or from the right, basically they're barking around the perimeter of the fertile solutions. They're barking around the perimeter to make sure that nobody can have the kinds of conversations that you need to have. You have to talk about those things imperfecly. You have to.
So why would the people be motivated to not allow that to happen, do you think?
Well, because there's different skews and everything is a generalization, right? So I'm going to generalize a little bit. I think that there's, in the far right, we see a kind of corruption and ossification around sort of Donald Trump and what he represents. But he was saying things that hit people in a way that were things that they weren't allowed to say. I have a whole bunch of theories about the Republicans. I'm going to keep it focused on my looking in the proverbial mirror. I think that a lot of the language policing of the left is actually a way to maintain the status quo. Because
what status quo? And to whose advantage?
Let's say that you're a rich Hollywood elite, much like me, right? Or, or somebody who is in the kinds of groups that I move in, that you move in, but let's say further left of you, like I am, or more, we're both liberal. But if you can talk and have all of the lingo and know exactly what the permission structures are, and you say Latin X instead of Latino, and you do all this stuff, and in a way, what you're doing is you're making sure that the conversations that are the real conversations that bring change, that are messier, don't necessarily occur. But if you have all the language down, you can sort of maintain your position and your money and your relative stature.
Yeah,
right?
So you can assume that if there was a solution that was being proposed, you'd be part of the solution and not part of the problem. You signal that with the language.
But you're also you're casting, like, look, I'll give you an example. I made a video about for me, I was exceedingly opposed from day one to messages of chaos from the Democratic Party, right? I think conservatives particularly have a reaction to chaos. I think they have a legitimate reaction when people announce sort of, police-free zones in Seattle and in Portland. And from day one, I was saying this whole notion of sanctuary cities doesn't make sense to me for a variety of reasons. Let's say we have the next president and people decide that voting rights are not going to be applied to in, Birmingham, Alabama, right? And they're going to be a sanctuary city for that. There's all these complexities around it. I made some commercials about Black leadership calling for a lack of violence in the protests. Keisha Lance Bottom, the mayor of Atlanta, gave a speech that I think was a speech with the most thundering moral authority that I've heard from a public figure when Atlanta was tearing itself apart. It's an extraordinary speech. I reference other people. The only blowback that I got from that was from incredibly affluent, sort of coastal elite saying, how dare you, selectively quote, African-American people decrying violence, when they watch somebody get murdered and they're protesting how they can. And it's the epitome of white privilege and it's all this stuff. And what's interesting is I've long thought that Trump works through projection. Like everything with Trump that he makes as a claim for others, there's a lot of projection that goes on. And I've increasingly seen that from aspects of the left where I thought, wow, how far do you have to be removed from the ramifications of violence to not be worried? Like, how many houses and mansions and security guards and gated communities do you have to have access to be unconcerned with violent action? Whether that community is a community of color, right? Whether it's a white working class community, to simply say violent protest is something that we're not for. Like, how dare you advocate that when you're rich enough to never have to be there when the tourist violent protesters leave and let's say the Black community is left there with the wreckage of their community. Like, to be opposed to that message is basically saying, I want to keep letting people protest as loud as they want. It's in a way that won't ever affect me or my children aren't at risk. My family's not at risk. My house doesn't feel at risk, but I'll use all the right language so that I can be protected and sort of maintain all of that. And when you're trying to wade in to really win an election so that we don't, the African-American community doesn't have to contend with more, I'll call it more voter rights being thrown out, like real concrete issues. There's real concrete issues there. But if you can chirp about something that's a slogan like that, you don't have to get into the real solutions or fixes. But at the same time,
right? But you can take on the assumed status of someone who's actually working to solve the problem. I think a lot of politically correct language, I guess that would be language that's in alignment with any given doctrine, is an attempt to take on the moral virtues of that doctrine without necessarily having to bear any of the responsibility for actions in alignment with that doctrine or to bear any responsibility for the consequences.
Like I was furious when the protests erupted with George Floyd. There were video after video of African Americans protesting. Some of them were like telling, turning in people who were either, anarchists who were throwing bricks and committing property damage, of saying, grabbing people, handing them over to the police. A lot of people in the African American community were like, this is our community. We live here. And of course, I'm not implying that nobody in the African American community crossed a line in the course of those protests. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying there was an awareness within that community that when the cameras are gone and the lights go up, nobody's going to come in and rebuild that community. And when all the tourists leave and everybody's had their march and their protest, they have to contend with it. And there was a measure of discipline in that community, whether it was Keisha Lance Bottoms. I think the president of the NAACP in either Oregon or Washington had a great op-ed. Killer Mike, the rapper, was out there saying, we cannot have violence. We're not tearing down our own city. This isn't civil disobedience. The point of civil disobedience, of course, is that you bear the cost, you bear the moral responsibility of your transgression of the law.
Right, exactly.
African community understood this by and large. And a lot of the loudest voices who were protesting against it, who were for me was a frustration, were from incredibly affluent, and here I'll use the word privilege, which I don't like to use, people in the white community. And that for me it's a similar kind of projection as I would see Trump doing. Like they're screaming about privilege all the time. And you're like, how do you not understand that destruction of property, destruction of small businesses, risks to families? Look, I'll give you a stat that's an interesting stat here. The average voter who voted for Obama and then Trump thinks about politics on average 4 minutes a week. 4 minutes a week, right? So people in the bubble don't think about politics 4 minutes a week. And so 4 minutes a week is about what you can manage to worry about the emoluments clause and Russian hacking when you're at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? You got a sick kid, you're out of health insurance, you don't have a job, you might have a special needs kid, you might have a parent in a home, you have COVID hitting. You don't have time for any of this. You don't have time to have the kinds of conversations around nuance of whether. And when everyone was shocked about the Latin vote, I was just thinking, how many of you people actually have friends and family who are Hispanic who you talk to? I mean, the joke was that the big shock was that Biden won the Latin X vote and Trump won the Latino vote. A lot of the Latino community, I mean, they don't. So
what do you think accounted for Trump's attractiveness to the Latino community? This kind of ties back in. This ties back into a broader question I want to ask you. It's like, I've been interested in what you've been doing and supporting it to the degree that I've been able to, and to the degree that that's useful, I suppose, because I was very interested in your willingness to look at what had gone wrong with the Democratic Party and to try to fix that. That seemed to me to be a win, that's a win for everyone, no matter where they are on the political spectrum, because the higher the function of both parties, the better the political outcome, as far as I'm concerned, right? You want as little stupidity as possible all across the spectrum. So it seemed to me that reducing some of the foolishness that characterized particularly the radical left, the careless radical left within the Democratic Party, and focusing on a more pragmatic, let's say, but also wiser and less resentment-driven strategy would be a good thing overall. So that opens up the broader can of worms, which is what exactly had the Democrats done so badly that they lost to Trump?
Well, so to me, there's a couple things. And we can talk about the Hispanic vote. We should talk about.
Let's talk about that specifically and the broader question in general.
Well, so look, I have friends and family who there's such an array of. We talk about the Hispanic vote like it's some monolith. Right? It's not remotely that. Cuban Americans are like, anything ever resembling socialism, I will never vote for you. And if you compare Trump to Fidel Castro, read a fucking book. That's basically the attitude of the Cuban Americans. Excuse my language. and they say, I don't care what he calls us. I don't care what he does to us. The only thing that we learned out of that is that the only power that you can trust is economic power. The rest of it's an illusion. And socialism wants to come in and threaten that. I want business opportunity, right? I want less regulations. They won't go near it. It's very, very different. And the Hispanic community it's incredible.
And so you think that's particularly true of the Cuban Americans?
Cuban, Venezuelan Americans.
Mm-hmm. Venezuelans, yeah. Well, they have reason for it.
Like a lot of the most conservative friends and associates who I have, whether it's people who are friends of mine, whether it's workers or Mexican Americans in LA, they don't want Mexico to come over here. They don't want open borders. Many of them, they left that. Why is that hard to understand? They tend to be, Catholic families. So if you think about politics for 4 minutes a week and somebody comes in all of a sudden and they're talking about socialism, defunding the police, and then announcing all sorts of gender complexities, and I say this as somebody with I preface it to say, I have a trans godson, lesbian sister. This is not like where my personal politics are for what people should be allowed to do and where my personal politics fall are very different than what I think the priority and the ranking of discussion is. If you're going to go talk to someone who thinks about politics for 4 minutes a week and bring up elaborate critical race theory and start to talk to them about the fact that boys aren't boys and girls aren't girls and they should just announce this and have announcements at the age of 18. I don't think any Democrats grasp when you think about politics 4 minutes a week and they talk about Trump and his transgressions, which I believe are more damaging and dangerous than those of the left. But I don't think anybody has any idea the kind of transgressions that represents to people who are either on the center or on the right. And
well, the 4 minutes a week thing really is interesting too, because one of the things I was really struck by over the last 4 years with all my encounters with journalists, many of which were good, by the way. I had lots of good encounters with journalists, but the worst encounters I ever had were almost always with journalists as well, is that the journalists think about the world politically all the time. Like every single decision they make, obviously this is a generalization, but if you're in that world, everything is political. But for the typical person, that's just not the case at all. And that's actually good. One of the best political science theories I ever read was predicated on the idea, or put forth the idea, that in a highly functioning political system, especially a democratic system, the less people think about politics, the better the system is working.
And towards the end, I didn't think politically at all. I'm not even interested in politics. I couldn't agree with that more. I mean, one of the things I think a lot about is I have a friend, one of my closest friends who you've met, born again Christian. He was raised as a son of a missionary, all through other parts of the world. And, but he lives in LA. He worked a bit in the industry, a very rounded conservative friend of mine. He has gay friends from whatever, but he went in the booth and told me during the election in 2016, he said, I just went in and I thought, forget it. I'm voting for Trump. I can't bring myself to vote for Hillary Clinton. I was really angry at him at first because it was like, and then I realized I shouldn't say really angry with him, but I realized that I didn't understand that for the things that I saw, for the clouds I saw massing on the horizon with Donald Trump. And we're seeing some of that here with the legal threats to the election, trying to undermine election security, his own largely appointed Republican judges shooting a lot of that down. There's a lot of things. We don't need to get into all that because everyone can have an answer for everything that I say. But the realization I had with him was, oh my God, he is a canary of a particular coal mine. He's a guy who rides a motorcycle. Yeah. He likes guns. He likes kind of different kinds of freedoms. He has a different relationship with freedoms versus security than I do. I'm a canary down a different coal mine, right? Part of that might be from me looking at the sort of authoritarian shadowiness that I saw coming in with Trump. That's what I alert to. I can't decide that my friend who I know and love and who has been in my house and accepts my friends, my family, everybody, and has a broad range of friends and family. I can't determine that he's either foolish or dumb or wrong or a bad person anymore. I can't determine that he's an ignorant canary down an ignorant coal mine, right? Because if he's my friend and I'm that close to him and he's here in LA, and that's a choice he made. I better listen to what that was, even if the gut instinct for him. And so then I was thinking about this a lot. And one of the things that I think has been a blessing of the Trump presidency is there's some conversations we're having now that are awful and hard. Like, it's sort of like, it's we talk about this all the time, obviously, with Jung, with Freud. You go through hell before you get anywhere else. We wouldn't be having any of these conversations if we were now in year 4 of a Hillary Clinton presidency. We're having different conversations. They're worse right now in a lot of ways about race, about class. But the fact that has stuck with me the most, and one of the things I'll say is I went in open-eyed all the way down to assess my party in the political situation. I've only gotten more disillusioned and angry with the Democratic Party.
So let's go return to that. Okay, I'm going to keep that in mind. Let's return to that. So you put together this team was organized to produce messages that would support the Democratic Party fundamentally. But the overarching philosophy was one of self-criticism, let's say, if the self includes the Democratic Party. And what other rules? What were the other rules for the messaging? See, I don't think people are going to understand exactly what you did. You made these ads, but you went out and did it with your own team. And so who are the ads generated? How are the ads generated? Who are they targeted to? What was their consequence? And what were the rules that you used and agreed on when you were making the ads? And how did you agree on them? Sorry, that's a lot of questions, but
part of this is it was all entrepreneurial, George. It was all outside of the political. I'd still be waiting for the first approval from the D-Trip-C to do my first, $2,000 commercial. We couldn't wait for it. The fiefdoms and bailiwicks within the party and the institutional, just bureaucratic mess is sufficient that a lot of what got done with a network of people entrepreneurially and free market, right?
That's pretty funny, really.
So Republicans.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it gave rise to it. And really all that it was our own ethical bearing. I ran the thing. And so we did testing to make sure that the ads were effective, that we weren't just shouting at each other on Twitter and getting the most likes. And
how define effective? How do you know?
I mean, there's a woman who's incredible who did, we did testing, focus groups. We saw how they move people. I mean, I can send you deck after deck after deck of the analysis.
Okay. So you were looking at post-exposure shift in political attitude as a consequence of the advertisements.
And what was nice was that our gut instinct, by that I mean me, Marshall, Billy, Lita, Sean, our gut instinct was, we're not going to make Trump bashing ads. We made some when they were fair. That was a big important thing. Like I did the one for Republican voters against Trump, where it was just Reagan sitting on a Hill speech. And I just showed Trump doing the opposite in every regard.
For the first time in our memory, many Americans are asking, does history still have a place for America? There are some who answer no, that we must tell our children not to dream as we once dreamed. Together, tonight, let us say that America is still united, still strong, still compassionate, still willing to stand by those who are persecuted or alone. For those who are victims of police states or government-induced torture or terror, let us speak for them. I believe we can embark on a new age of reform in this country that will make government again responsive to people. We can fight corruption while we work to bring into our government women and men of competence and high integrity. Tomorrow, you will be making a choice between different visions of the future. Are you more confident that our economy will create productive work for our society? Or are you less confident? Do you feel you can keep the job you have or gain a job if you don't have one? Are you pleased with the ability of young people to buy a home, of the elderly to live their remaining years in happiness, of our youngsters to take pride in the world we have built for them? Are you convinced that we have earned the respect of the world and our allies? Let us resolve tonight that young Americans will always find a city of hope in a country that is free. And let us resolve they will say of our day and of our generation that we did keep faith with our God, that we did act worthy of ourselves, that we did protect and pass on lovingly that shining city on a hill.
in the op-eds, I was equally harsh on Democrats and Republicans both. But, so part of it was for me, as I said, we can never lie to any standard. I don't want to bend the truth. I don't want to lie. I went out and got a hardcore lifelong Wall Street Republican to do all the fact checking. And it was down to like, even if we were kind of bullshitty about something.
You mean he'd respond?
Sorry?
You asked him to tell you if he thought that you had been even playing with the truth rather than breaking it.
Oh, and I paid him as a researcher to say, here's the claims we're making. Are they fair? Check multiple sources. And I wanted somebody who expressly was not a Democrat to do all of that. Yeah,
well, that seems to me to be, you'd want to have someone like that around you if you're making complex political decisions.
That's right.
You need an enemy to tell you, to point out your weaknesses. Okay, so you set up this crew, which was quite large to begin with and then got smaller. You went and met with Democrat leaders.
Yeah, we spoke. Marshall and I addressed both caucuses, and we in an ongoing way, we do candidate training and we deal with leadership also.
So how is it that you managed to look? One of the things you said was that had you waited around for permission, you'd still be waiting. And then another thing that needs to be pointed out to people is that without permission, you could go ahead anyways and make your political statement, right? You just had to go do it. But you still have positive relationships with the Democratic Party per se. Now, isn't that weird? How the hell do you account for that? Why not?
Because I was fair and I was respectful. And what we did was, it's like that judge's description of pornography. I don't know what it is, but I know it when I see it.
Mm-hmm.
And so Marshall and I would say, look, we know how to make a unifying, uplifting message that's positive, that brings back sort of core democratic values and can speak across the aisle to people with a psychological profile that's more conservative, with an understanding and respect for the fact that conservatives and liberals in concert are what holds society together. Now, Marshall and I have an opinion that is that the dangerous aspects of the left are embodied mostly in academia, culture, let's call it journalism, and then a small, tiny cabal of very far left members of the Democratic Party. And to some extent, it's crept through the party. Some of the things that are the excess of the left that obviously you've discussed at great length. For us on the right, it is codified all the way through the Senate, all the way up to Donald Trump, who holds the nuclear football. So I was trying to figure out, well, why does this threat from the left that to me is much less, but just as dangerous? And there's a lot of canaries in coal mines going, hey, man, pay attention. That's bad news. The same way that we were about Trump. Why is it being given kind of this equal, if not more, weighting to what I felt was the clear and present danger of the excesses of the Trump administration and what was happening there? And so part of it is the respectful conversation with Trump voters, or mostly. I'm sure I screwed up plenty, but and to do a unifying message and to show them. One of the things people don't realize is that messaging becomes content. If we could get the message right, we could solidify the story, and then that could change policy, and then that can change the Democratic platform.
Okay, so
right?
we talked a lot about that when you first embarked on this venture. So, and correct me if I'm wrong about as far as you're concerned, about anything that I'm saying. The first thing is that if you produce a message, a story, that story has an ethic, has an implicit ethic. And if the story is accepted, then the implicit ethic is accepted. And then the implicit ethic will be made explicit across time. So a story is like, it's like the seed ground for explicit policy. So
That's
you
right.
you got a grip on the story. Now, one of the things that concerned me about the radical left was that because they had a story, and it's a powerful mythological story, benevolent nature, tyrannical culture, the noble savage, that's another part of it. Because they had a coherent story, they had a disproportionate effect on policy. And the moderate Democrats.
Not on policy. So let me just interrupt.
Okay.
Not on policy. So if you look at, so AOC did the Green New Deal, pushed that through, which to me was not an adult piece of legislation. It was a Trojan horse filled with everything. 0 votes in the Senate, 0 votes from the Democrats. Every measure, if you look at HR1, is anti-corruption. It was prescription drug. There was the actual policies and body of who the Democrats are is much more moderate and pro-capitalist than it is in policy. So what's being parroted loudly is not, in fact, Democratic policy. In my estimation, the flaw or the fault in the Democratic Party is their failure to stand up and keep the elements of the party in their proper places, to state who they are and to draw a line for what they're opposed to. And I think that act of them being like, well, we can't really, we're concerned to criticize, defund the police, or we're too concerned.
Yeah.
Part of what I would say to them was, look, if you're scared of AOC's Twitter following, Americans are not going to deem you to be worthy of carrying the nuclear football. Like, that's just a very low checksum analysis. If you can't just clearly say that defunding the police, whether that means other things, which it does, is a slogan that makes no sense and terrifies the vast majority of Americans, rightly so, and a ton of immigrants, rightly so, or people of Hispanic origin. If you can't understand and state that clearly because you're afraid of the blowback, you're not going to be trusted to lead. And so it's a problem of degree. And I think that's one of the biggest topics of friction you and I have had for a long time, not negative friction, but just where we've been hammering away at that, where I keep saying to you, the radical left is not the kind of threat in America relative to the threat that's posed by Donald Trump as it represents in Canada. And we can disagree about that, because I think that the threats represented by the radical left represent an equally dystopic and
I can tell
future.
you, I don't really understand it myself to some degree, is that I've been more, and this is a surprise to me, I would say, I've been more reactive to the threat posed by the radical leftists. And I think it's possible that it's because I'm in academia. And so
can I tell you why? I have a theory about why that is too.
Okay. Yeah.
My theory is that the right comes in the front door. They're like, here we are. We want more money. We want more power. We don't like government. We're going to shrink it. Even the let's call it racism or anything that goes down from that pole to in-group favoritism, right? Like normal in-group favoritism. There's plenty of people who are like, look, I grew up in rural North Carolina. I'm fine with having a black president. I'm fine with doing whatever. This is my culture. I don't want to be asked to celebrate another culture all the time in every way or else be called racist. That doesn't make sense to me. Whereas the left comes in and they say, well, we like all of our stuff and we like our whole situation, like the examples I was giving earlier. We're going to say defund the police when we're rich enough to not be in a neighborhood that will have an effect of. We're above the pale that if everything is moved through that lens, we're successful enough that we have money and we have resources anyways. And we're going to wrap ourselves in sanctimony, right? We're going to wrap ourselves in sanctimony, want to maintain the status quo as much as you do, but pretend it's because we're morally superior and you're morally inferior. And that's shame inducing. That's like a maternal scolding instinct that elicits, I think, rage. And so that's a big difference in the two. And I think that accounts for why some people are like, hey, look, it's complicated. There's this element of moral superiority. And one of the things that, I did so much work with the evangelical community, and they've been great, like making good faith arguments to reach out and talking about, the values and attributes of Christ and trying to talk to voters. And there were some voters who we were very successful in talking to. I want to say Obama got 26% evangelical vote. Hillary didn't go after it at all. She got 13 and lost, and Biden was back up at 22, 23. We thought that was a very important community to talk to. What people don't realize is if you look at Trump, if you look at anybody from a Christian worldview, you can dislike you can dislike him legally, you can dislike the policies, you can dislike a lot of these politicians, but the deeming of somebody as morally inferior, right? Whether it's followers of Trump, whether it's, MAGA voters, no one can do that but God. You're not allowed to do that. You don't know where someone is on their journey. You don't know if he's a sinner at the nadir of his existence and is going to turn around. And there's a bigger, weird moral frame that gets put on it. Of course, there's aspects of that will come in from the right, with homosexuality, with the more racist element. But that aspect, if I'm arguing that the right has been more infected up the power structure by the worst authoritarian excesses of the right, I think that the narrative of moral judgment has infected a wider swath of the left, if that makes sense.
Well, it's worth thinking about anyways. I mean, it's a real mystery to me because I suspect that particularly because I'm Canadian, and so that puts me culturally to the left of the typical American, let's say. I suspect if I read through a list of policy decisions made by the Democrats and made by the Republicans over the last 20 years, and I was blind to the party who supported it, I would end up supporting more Democrat legislation than Republican legislation. But there's still something about the radicals on the left that disturb me in a way that.
Look, so here's another way to look at it, right? We've all seen Cape Fear, right? In Cape Fear, guy gets out of prison, he goes after his defense attorney. Criminals who are escaped, who do go after counsel, go after the defense attorney and not after the prosecutor. And the reason for that is percentage wise. And I believe that's true. I've heard that. I haven't sourced it, but let's pretend it's true for the sake of this parallel. I think a lot of what has happened is people figure the prosecutor's doing their job. But if your defense attorney who's supposed to be looking out for you doesn't, there's a different kind of anger. I think that's what the Democrats represent.
So it's a betrayal.
Yes, I think that's
interesting.
So here's the uber statistic for everything for me that when I arrived at, I felt like the scales fell from my eyes. Over the last 40 or 50 years, $50 trillion with a T have moved from the bottom 90% of Americans to the top 1%. That's not through innovation, competition, and pure free market capitalism. It's just not. It's corporate giveaways. It's lobbyists writing bills. There's a whole structure.
It's the weird inevitability of the Pareto distribution, right? The idea, the age-old law that the rich get rich and the poor get poor. It's unbelievably difficult to keep that under control. And it is definitely something that destabilizes societies.
And that's the thing. And it's been done largely, that 50 trillion, effects of globalization certainly play a role in that. But it's not like all of a sudden everybody who's a CEO got that much more brilliant. So this is the largest transfer of wealth, I believe, in history. And it didn't go a socialist way. That's when everyone's pulling their hair out about socialism. I just look at it and go, $50 trillion. So if you're white working class, and that happened under Obama, that happened under Clinton.
Yeah, well, that's the peculiar thing is that it's not self-evident that policy can stop that. Like, one of the things I've been terrified about since really learning about the Pareto distribution is its implacability. You know, as you pointed out, this distribution happened even under systems of governance or ideologies of governance that hypothetically should have stopped it or at least slowed it. It'd be interesting to find out if that transfer took place more rapidly under Republicans than Democrats or not.
Well, I think that whatever it is, if you look at that one fact, that is a failing of basically the entire ruling class in America. Like that, and part of, I realized that I had a moment of realization. I'm going to tell you this. It was really funny. So, there was the TARP give after 9/11, there was the TARP bailout and the airlines were in trouble and they were bailed out. My statistics might be slightly wrong, but call it $53 billion bailout. Okay. When COVID hit, they needed another, and we were, us Democrats were hopeful that would go into the workers and everyone else. It went into stock buyback so that the stock prices rose, right? 35% of the stock market is foreign owned. It was a straight corporate giveaway. That's a transfer of wealth. It didn't go back to the workers. That pissed me off. When COVID started, they asked for another bailout and it was like the exact same number. Call it $52 billion. I got all mad. I'm like, I'm going to call Marshall. We're going to do a commercial. And I stopped for a minute and I said, you know what? I'm the asshole who's being served by that. And I don't mean this in a self-flagellating privileged way. Like, let me take a peek into my 401k. Guess what stocks I'm probably holding, right? A ton of airline stock. So when there's a stock buyback, which I can get angry about, part of the thing is to have a realization to go, look, that's
a really good example, because it shows that's a good, what would you say? That sheds an interesting light on the implacability of the Pareto distribution. It's like you're part of the problem, even though you object to it ideologically, and you're part of the problem because of where you sit in the economic structure. And
right. But the thing is about this, and you talk about regulation or policies not working, which I want to return to in a minute. But part of what I realized was that's not because I'm a good investor. That's not because I'm smart. That's not free market.
It's not because you're cruel and malevolent either.
No, it's not. But this is not my investing genius or the free market at work, right? We don't have a transfer of wealth of that extent going the other direction. And so part of it is like, okay, so I'm a beneficiary. So what a solution for a lot of things is, you know, you give money, you scream about privilege, and you self-flagellate. As far as I'm concerned, that's all it's a self-focused reaction, as opposed to me saying, how do we start to address that problem? And the thing is it has to be partially policy, partially regulation. We can no longer.
Well, it is something that we fight all the time. You know, one of the things you just said shed light, I think, again, for me, on my irritation with the left end of the ideological spectrum, is that it's just too much to see people who benefit, say, like, who are in a position like you are, or like I am in, because we're net beneficiaries of the Pareto distribution in a major way. Now, it seems to me too much for me to also expect to be admired as a paragon of virtue in relationship to my attitude towards the poor, let's say. Because then I'm asking for too much. I'm asking to be a beneficiary of the system the way it's set up now. And I'm asking to be admired for my objection to the very system that is enriching me. And the second one of those is too much to ask for.
And the solution for that, and like when I had that realization, I was like, let me get on that. Let me look at policies. Let's have an economic summit like the one you and I did. Like, and I'm not claiming I'm going to like go out and fix the whole problem, but if all I do is sit around and go, oh, I feel so guilty, let me do a couple think pieces about it and talk about white privilege. It's innate. It's just more self-focused bullshit for those people who think about politics 4 minutes a week, because they can only afford to think about politics for 4 minutes a week. So what do? And what I do is I try to advocate for, you know, policies that will work, even if some of those are conservative policies, right? I mean, I have a ton of people across the aisle, across the whole spectrum, who I'd reach out to, go, what do you think of this? Are there libertarian answers? There's got to be some regulatory answers, because it's so out of control.
Well, hopefully, because the end of the Pareto game is that far too few people have far too much of everything. And that's not even good for them. I mean, you're not rich if you have to live in a gated community.
That's right.
That's a gilded cage. You know, it's not an indication of wealth. Wealth is when you can walk around your city freely at night. That's wealth.
That's exactly it. And so that's so much of what we arrived at in the messaging when we try to talk to people across the aisle, country club Republicans, let's say. There's a difference for me for people who are at the wrong end of this system. And it pisses me off when people get so angry about the fact that like all these people are voting in ways that hurt their own interests, right?
Yeah.
And I always say, like, I vote in ways that hurt my own interests. I don't just vote. Like, how do you know what their interests are? Their interests could be moral. Their interests could be familial. Their interests could be religious. It's not just their financial interests, first of all.
Yeah, their interest could be their children's future rather than their own current reality. I mean, I learned a long time ago that small businessmen didn't vote for socialist policies in Canada, even when they were pro small business, because they didn't want to be small businessmen. They wanted to be big businessmen. So they were voting their dream, not their reality. And it's not obvious that that's a mistake, even though, well, you could criticize it and you could point out its lacks, but it doesn't mean its inadequacies, but that doesn't mean that it's a mistake.
So let's get into the canary in the coal mine discussion again. So I think, like, for me, it's glaringly apparent, and I know lots of people, especially a good number of the people who are your listeners, will in good faith disagree with me on that. To me, it's glaringly apparent the difference in terms of what a Trump presidency, let's say, and a Biden presidency in terms of the relative levels of corruption and undermining of the democratic norms. I know there's a lot of counter arguments. I'm happy to have all of those. But for the sake of this discussion, from my perspective, it's this big slice here, like of a totem pole. The vast majority of Americans are so far down. They're so far down below that when they're looking up, they can't possibly distinguish some subtle, well, you see Trump, it's an emoluments clause and he's doing fundraisers on the South Lawn of the White House and that's unacceptable. But the kind of fundraising and enrichment that the Clintons did was different for this other, they can't differentiate that. So for me, and so then that gets to the question of, was the vote for Trump, like my friend who went in that booth and said, forget it, I don't care. Was that a wiser thing because that's a higher disagreeable irritation structure before we get somebody who's even more threatening from the right?
That's a good question. It's certainly possible.
Is the Trump presidency, there's no way now that we can move forward, I think, without having much more robust and angry dialogue about that $50 trillion movement from the bottom 90 to the top 1%. Right. And there's some race conversations beyond the, I believe that the surface stuff that we distract ourselves with all the time, like cultural appropriation, there's all these issues. And there's,
I've often thought, and I'm interrupting you partly because this is such a crucial point, that distribution of wealth problem. I've come to believe that even though the left focuses on that as the primary problem, they actually don't focus on it enough because the attribution of the problem is wrong. I don't think there's any evidence whatsoever that the Pareto distribution is a secondary consequence of the capitalist system. So what that means to me is that the left-wingers aren't actually taking the problem of relative poverty seriously enough because they've got a handful of stock answers that have been applied with absolutely no success whatsoever. And in their more radical guises, they're not looking at the problem with enough seriousness, but the problem exists. And it doesn't exist too because people are malevolent or greedy, although that might add to it. It's much more complex problem than that, and one that's much more difficult to solve.
But some of the greediness, like the level of lobbying in America, and with lobbyists literally submitting bills and forgetting to take the lobby firm's heading off the paper as they go to Senate, there's an aspect of that. But the other way that I look at that is to go, how badly did we fail as capitalists? And that's me, right? Yeah. How badly did we fail that enough people went and picked up this shiny object called socialism or democratic socialism, which is different from socialism, and think that that's a good idea?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's the reverse of the question the Democrats should be asking themselves. So the Democrats should be asking themselves, well, how did Trump become so attractive? What did we do wrong? And the right-wingers, the more conservative types, should be asking, we haven't solved the problem of wealth distribution well enough to stop socialism from being attractive as an option, even though the historical record with regards to its more radical forms is dreadful.
And we've also failed to embody the core values of free market capitalism, innovation, competition, where we have not pulled the ladder up behind us, where we have allowed and built a robust system of smart capitalism all the way down that is a solid foundational base that we can stand on to win. It's so
goddamn difficult. It's so goddamn difficult, though. Like, look, let me give you an example. So I started a company 20 years ago, and it struggled along for a long time. And then when I got better known, that solved our marketing problem. But it's a psychological testing company. And when we first designed it, we consciously designed a company that would require no employees, that would have no overhead, and that would be replicable. So it was computerized, and so it can scale without an increase in cost. And like, I'm sensitive to the problems caused by the Pareto distribution, but when I set up that company, I set it up in a way that absolutely contributed to it. Because we don't pay no one in this company gets paid except the 3 people that own it. That's it. And that's part of the inexorability. I can't say that damn word. Inexorability. I just did the audio version of my book and I had to redo all the times I said inexorable because I said it wrong. Anyways, it's the inexorability of the Pareto distribution is very difficult to escape from. It'd be lovely if we could have a discussion politically where that problem became central and everyone's attention could be focused on that. The capitalists who we could admire, at least in some guises, could sit down and say, look, we have to figure out how to get more money to the bottom part of the population within a structure that can also generate wealth, because of course capitalism does that extremely well. So that problem has to be brought to the forefront.
The thing is, the further I got into this, Jordan, the more that I realized that everything foundationally is moral. That's it. You said once to me, and I think like shortly after college, you said there's only moral decisions. That's it. I was like, that's so weird though, because sometimes there's pragmatic, sometimes there's something. And the more you look at that, the more it's borne out that in fact, like any shortcut you pay for, any shortcut pushes. I mean, look, we don't have to get all into Jungian synchronicity, but you know that drill. And so one of the things that I think about a lot is that we can argue as if we're sitting around in college, right, drinking, and there's a libertarian and there's a conservative and there's a liberal or a Democrat, conservative and liberal, let's say. And we all know what we're going to say already. Nothing that is pure ideologically will ever work or function. And the only answer to it, like for me, part of what I realized was I'm going to be arrogant enough to try to go on an adventure that tries to tell stories, not re-message the Democrats that I'm lying and repackaging and putting pig on a lipstick, that I can make an argument for classic.
I think you meant lipstick on a pig.
What did I say?
You said pig on a lipstick, which gets the ratio of pig to lipstick seriously wrong. That should appeal to the Trump viewers of this broadcast.
That's horrible. That's horrible. But it's not about, it can't be about deception, right? It has to be about making actual arguments for why the core liberal values that I believe are most imperfectly but approximately embodied by the Democrats can have appeal to conservatives, right? And we've talked all that big.
Well, hopefully you also tilt the Democrats in that direction, like by producing that message, right? It gives them, it gives them a center around which to align. Absolutely a necessary thing. You need that center.
But here's the complexity that I realize is we didn't make any money at all. We said everything is pro bono. And we didn't have any credit, and we wouldn't have done any of this. Like the no permission part is like, here we went off and did it. But there's a ton of money to be made in advertising. I mean, I sent you that article, right? There's an estimate that we created, you know, and it could very well be off or overblown, but there's an estimate that the ad structures that we put in place created $1 billion of advertising. We aimed it at the swing states. We aimed it at evangelicals. We aimed it at the Hispanic communities and the places that really mattered a lot. That's a lot of value, even if it's off by 50%. And the thing is part of how we got there was people, when they do an ad buy with a commercial, they make money on the ad buy, right? And so part of it was we'd go off, we'd make some commercial, we'd test it, we'd make sure that it was honest. It would be saying something that's slightly different, but the cost of having our message conveyed in a way that might hope to be transformational was for us to give it to them and say, here, say that you did it. And if there's any sales or anything to do with it, you go make a bunch of money off it and just say it was you. And so that's the price of it. Because if we said, well, we want to be cut in on the revenue streams, then they'd have a bunch of reasons to choose their own creative over our creative, right?
Right. So what you did by taking yourself out of the fee structure, you enabled your voice.
That's right. And we allowed for other people. It's like, you don't get to have all these things, right? We don't get to have all the credit and make a ton of money and also be adored by the Democratic establishment and then also be transformative. And so I'm not saying that like it's any great shakes morally, but that was the part of me that was like, the solution isn't in doing. The solution is in when I realized the airline buyout thing, that I was an inadvertent recipient of that in a way that's kind of rigged. That's kind of a rigged game when there's a buyout and there's a stock buyout and I just make more money despite them being in failure, is to do stuff and to try and do stuff properly. And so I think that a lot of it is we have such a failure of moral leadership right now in corporations. I mean, I was thinking back to like, wouldn't it be amazing if we looked up to, you know, more leaders of industry and more for the, it just, we're so removed from our paragons, from our avatars of meaning, I guess is what I mean to say. Like the fact that a politician is supposed to be there to help you and to do good for the community is almost laughable now. The fact that a college or university represents the production of a Renaissance man or woman in pure form. I mean, the lie of that, I think, was laid bare by that college admissions scandal. People were so furious about it because the answer to that should be no kid could cheat to get into university. They'd wash out in the first month if they didn't deserve to be there in a way. So we're removing ourselves, like the money-making mechanism of business. Like great businesses and business people should be building a whole pyramid and structure of success under them. That's how you win in 10 years.
Part of that again is that's a time frame problem, you know, is that the more morally fundamental a decision is, the longer the time frame over which it operates. And so you might expect people who are benefiting from the capitalist system to set up their structures so that capitalism itself would be supported across a long span of time. And that would mean cutting in the people that in the bottom of the hierarchy. But short-term considerations arise to make doing such things very, very difficult.
Right. And if you keep making it difficult another 8, 10, 12 years, then AOC is the president and the whole system's going to change, let's say.
Right. Well, that's the risk. If the system fails enough people, then there's enough people who are willing to, especially young men, who are willing to take their chances in the revolution. You know, at least it's exciting.
So here's the hardest thing that I had to figure out, which was this. I had an okay time. I think part of this is I've always had a very diverse background of friends. Because I write thrillers, I have a lot of friends in the military community, a lot of kind of hardcore conservatives. The hardest thing for me was to try to apply the same self-awareness of my blind spots and, I don't want to say empathy, but sort of seek to really understand the further elements of the left. That was the hardest thing for me. Instead of just saying, you're idiots and you're squawking, you're doing all this stuff, to really slow down and listen and to understand that a lot of these younger, especially the younger kids, who are coming up, who are very attracted to democratic socialism, who are way more radical in a lot of their views than are appealing to me. When I stopped and looked at the world through their perspective and could get over my inherent, like, you're always more angry at your own side in some ways, the access to your own side. But man, I have, you know, my wife's a college professor, as you know, and she teaches at CSUN, which is a lot of the kids, Cal State Northridge, a lot of kids from tough backgrounds. Like they don't have time to be political. Those are the kids she has. They're working 2 jobs. There's help support their family. They're raising their younger sibling. Like these are working kids. So many of those kids come out and they made the right choices, not drugs, not, you know, didn't wind up in prison. They went and did this. They're holding their family together. They have like $130,000 in debt coming out. And they're in jobs that they're earning, you know, maybe they have a master's in psychology at the end of it, and they're making $33 an hour.
Well, you know, so that means the price to buy into the system at a point where you have a chance of thriving can't get too high. So student loan debt would certainly contribute to that, as would the entry price of real estate.
That's right.
Okay, so that's a real danger. So, but I think that people are.
Why wouldn't you look at other means and other systems, and why wouldn't you just criticize the system? And for us to come along and say, well, that's ridiculous, and democratic socialism and defund like all these things you're talking about the system are so foolish.
Well, I think you could look. The other thing that you can you can credit especially young people who are attracted to the farther left ideals is that there is genuine concern about the unfairness of the economic distribution. It's like,
that's right.
And so there are a lot of poor people who are at zero, which is a hell of a place to be, because you get to the point where you can't get out because you need I don't know how to say it exactly. You can't afford a bank account. You can't afford an address. Like, you can't get the basic necessities that would allow you to play in the system.
You can't afford $20 a month, the fee to keep your bank account open if you're under $1,000.
Right, exactly. And so that's the cost of being stuck at zero. And young people look at that and they think, well, that's a terrible waste of human resources, which it is, and it's dreadfully unfair, which it is.
That's
now,
right.
the problem is that the solutions that are conjured up on the radical left don't seem to work, but I think not well anyways. So I think it's reasonable to say you can be sympathetic to the motivations that drive the attraction to those theories. And it would be lovely if they work, but so many of them, when put into practice, don't produce the result that's intended. Like, I don't see any evidence. I've looked, and it's tough to parse through it, but it isn't the evidence that left-wing governments have been better at controlling the Pareto distribution problem than right-wing governments is very sparse. And that actually is unbelievably disheartening.
But I think we're getting too academic abstract with it in a way. And I think that part of it is to say, when they say that, we go, here's a bunch of facts. And to me, that's the same thing with a MAGA voter, let's say, of me coming in and going, here's a bunch of facts about Donald Trump's corruption, rather than joining and saying, look, you're 22. You're not supposed to have a world economic view and an understanding of the whole breadth of history, especially from our academic systems that are failing you as you're under crippling debt and you're addicted to screens because companies have hired teams of addiction specialists to, throw shrapnel in your nervous system, and the biomed companies are all over you. They're being devoured from every angle. And we're coming in with PowerPoint presentations about why it's dumb, rather than going, God, you're right. There's a lot of problems here, and maybe some of the language and reasons and reasoning that you're moving towards aren't the ones that will get you where you want to be, but boy, are you right about a lot. Let's start from there then. Like, you can't change somebody's opinion without seeking to understand them first. That's
their motivations, absolutely. And you shouldn't assume that all the positive motivations are on your side. Okay, I want to ask you some other questions here. So you produced 200 commercials. We're going to show some of those interspersed in this video. Now, how are they distributed? How many people watched them? That's the first question.
We did a ton of online digital. Excuse me. They ranged. Some of them we ran during NFL games in swing states on television. Some of them, like the Reagan City on a Hill one of the benefits was some of the ones we did were really innovative in ways that are kind of fun that we could talk about in different ways. And so we got secondary, like our Reagan City on a Hill one, Brian Williams asked James Carvell about that on his show. So there was also a secondary sort of conversational aspect of crossover into mainstream media in different ways, because people would then write. I did a whole series of ASMR commercials. This is a fun.
What's ASMR?
Oh, it's the whisper. Do you remember those videos where people would like whisper and make sounds on the microphone that were super trendy?
No, I must have been out of function. I must have been malfunctioning during that period.
But so basically, we realized that the commercials that a lot of the Democratic agencies were putting were these like, Trump is beholden to China, and it would have the dark, shadowy Trump and all the stuff. And so a lot of, and they got tons of people are mashing the like button and sharing it. But what we found in some of the testing, there's a brilliant woman we work with the testing, is it moved undecided voters 10 points towards Trump. And the reason for that is if your nervous system is put into fight or flight by the ominous score and the facts, then you move more towards, you're more inclined or receptive to
conservative messaging.
That's right. Jingoism, xenophobia, strongman leadership.
Yes.
So I did this commercial series where we hired a wonderful actress to whisper. It's a sort of seductive whispering of the mic, because I thought we need to talk to voters' nervous systems. That's another part of storytelling, right? You're not talking just to their prefrontal cortex. You want to talk to the decision-making mechanisms. We need to lower the guard because there's so much screaming about politics. And so that was what we did. She said, there's so much screaming, I want to tell you, this is the only way we can cut through the noise. And it's a sort of whispered, soft messaging.
Hi there. It's just you and me. And this hard-boiled egg. So, after looting everything else, Donald J. Trump is looting our election. He hired his rich donor buddy to slash the postal service so our votes can't be counted. Voter suppression is Trump's biggest grab. Vote early. Still some shell. Sounds. Midas Touch is responsible for the content of this advertising. Let's get his paws off of our eggs.
So that was effective. And then that got written up in a bunch of places secondarily.
So how many people are typically viewing these ads?
Most of the ones that we did with big launches were in the millions.
And how would that compare to it? Well, I could say a typical political ad, but this is atypical because in some sense, because the technological infrastructure for doing this is so new. I don't know what you'd compare it to, because an ad used to be an evanescent thing, right? You'd throw it up on a TV show and it could run in sequential TV shows, but the ad would run and then people wouldn't have access to it. Now, of course, they have access to everything all the time. So I don't know what you compare it to.
It would be Instagram, it would be Facebook, It's on Twitter, then it's shared widely. Then some of them we cut down and we ran on television stations. But we got, I think I could confidently say we got over 100 million views of stuff, if not more.
Okay. What kind of, here's a nasty question, I suppose. What good did you do and what harm did you do? Or what harm might have you done? Let's start with good. What good do you think you did within the Democratic Party, let's say?
Well, we have advocated and elevated. The purest place for me in the Democratic Party are the first-time House candidates. That's the love for me to work with, because it's so hard as people move up in the structure and make all the compromises that they have to make. It gets more and more sticky, and the fiefdoms and bailiwicks and so the House candidates are wonderful. We supported them. I think we had a big, look, I would say it's so hard to say, and it's so hard to want to take
credit.
I wouldn't want to remove our efforts from the midterm or from the presidential. I wouldn't be comfortable removing them and thinking that the outcome is the same. Now, whether that's a slice that we laid on top of tons of people who did other work and laid other slices down, community organizers, the politicians, and yes, the democratic institutions with fundraising, the DCCC, there is some credit that is there too. But we put and targeted all of our messaging. Our theory of the case was right. We put it straight into the swing states. We put it straight into persuasion messaging for moderate voters. We went after a lot of Hispanic commercials. Like, our theory of the case was right. We went after evangelicals. We didn't.
So what do you mean? But what do you mean by theory of the case?
We didn't do anything that was woke, politically correct.
Oh,
Everything for us was ambitious. It was unifying. We had diversity in our ads. We did several sort of Black Lives Matter. We had the Lincoln Project. I got one to them, but they were very clean on the parameters of what we were representing as a unified, positive vision of America. And our criticism, I think some of the commercials with Trump here or there, we did get, I failed in getting snarky in ways that might not have been as fair or persuasive.
So you did get snarky in a way that
was not as persuasive here or there. Some of those 200 ads, if I look back on, I'd go, yeah, but I had an instinct and I'd send them to testing and I'd get the answer back. I was like, I think I can try this way in of this kind of attack route.
Okay.
And we got back, that was like, nope, it's turning people off again. And I was wrong. So I was wrong plenty. I mean, I rushed into being wrong everywhere again and again and again. We didn't understand the permission structures. We didn't understand the etiquette. And at a certain point, early on, it was funny. I joke with Billy. He'd send an email out to like a bunch of senators and heads of different committees. And I'd get like a worried call from one of our political people being like, you can't CC all these people. There's all this internal, stuff going on. And so the first reaction is kind of chagrin or embarrassment of like, oh, we stumbled into, this not knowing anything. But then we were like, wait a minute, that's idiotic. We're trying to win a race. If everything that you're saying you believe, that Trump is that damaging and threatening, we don't have time for any of this internecine bullshit. So knock it off. We're going to CC all of you. We don't have time to break that up. And everyone kind of went, okay. Like, we were so clueless in some ways that it almost benefited us, because we were breaking a lot of established norms in little ways that if people came up with an issue about whether it was some subtlety of language policing or hierarchical stuff or bureaucracy, we just said, we're not doing any of that. We're here to win. If you don't want to be involved, we'll take you right off, but we're not going to navigate any of those things. And since no one had given us permission and no one was paying us, no one could fire us. And so it just worked. It was really weird.
Well, it is really weird that it was even possible, but it's less weird when the weird thing is that you did this without any payment, that you just decided to do it. And the second weird thing is that you actually went ahead and did it. And as a project, it worked, even though the outcome of it might be very difficult to measure. You
Here's
alluded
the other harm I did. You asked about the harm.
Well, I wanted to go more into the good first, though. Okay. You talked about the newly elected people. You didn't tie that exactly to the good that you've done, but there obviously is a link there. So I'm just going to ask you to make that more explicit.
They're the best hope. We have amazing candidates. If you looked up Alyssa Slotkin, if you looked up Dean Phillips, if you looked up Haley Stevens, if you looked up Lucy McBath, some people we lost this round because of the bad messaging, really bad party messaging and inability to draw a line against socialism and defund the police. But we work with candidates like Michelle de la Isla, who's the mayor of Topeka in Kansas.
Okay. So you're pleased about the effectiveness of your strategy on raising the overall capacity for performance of a new generation, or part of a new generation of political decision makers,
who I admire and who anybody reasonable. If you sat down with Alyssa Slotkin, who is 20 years in the CIA, you might not agree with her on all the politics. It's impossible to not completely admire her as a stateswoman. She's an exceptional.
So
person.
You think you were on the side of the high quality people.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's cool. All right. I mean, it's hard for me to see.
And I got us more oriented on getting things done and accomplished than talking about them theoretically.
Okay.
In terms of like, here's how we get shit done now. It's enough with the abstract. People are hurting. People are in a bad place. And I think also to some extent, I've helped to untangle in small, look, it's so hard. I think I've done a lot I helped build a coalition. I played a role in stitching together, the Rick Wilsons and the David Frums and the Bill Crystals. Of course, they're doing it on their own, and a lot of people had reach, but I was the center of a particularly diverse and interesting, Chris Halverson, who you introduced me to, right? The former chaplain of the Senate, evangelical leader. There's people who I called and pulled into ventures in a whole host of different ways. One of my favorite candidates who lost this time due to bad, again, messaging that was unfair, wonderful woman, Xochitl Torres-Small. She was in the most rural district of any Democrat. Democrats don't tend rural in New Mexico. So I called Chris Halverson, who you introduced me to, and I said, she's a Christian woman. She's a woman of faith. She's bipartisan. She's in the most rural district, and she has concerns about rural medicine or rural healthcare. And that's not predominantly Democrat. Who are Republicans who you can get her in touch with to help solve that problem for constituents? It's a win for her. That just helps people in a rural district. It's politically agnostic. And ideally, we would be politically agnostic. Like, I would love to support Republican candidates who I felt like were, good faith.
Well, that's the question, because you could look at this as a zero-sum game, and you could say, well, it's bad news for the conservatives if better quality liberals emerge on the political landscape, because their probability of victory is higher. But then you could take the opposite viewpoint. You could say, no, everyone wins if the quality of candidates on both sides of the spectrum are elevated, if the quality is elevated.
And that's the only thing that keeps us. See, I view the extremism like we're on a seesaw, right? And so the game theory is that if people are in the middle and they're dealing with each other, like, Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan, everyone can kind of be in the middle and you think the seesaw. But when one group starts to move and it's chicken or egg, the other has to move out to hold balance. And when you have the mainstream media divided since essentially the Gore Vidal, William Buckley Jr. debates, and there's a wonderful documentary, The Best of Enemies.
I saw it. Yeah.
Yeah. And you have social media driving that way. And you have, capitalism by appropriating people for dopamine hits for the most extremism online, moving people that way. Everybody's moved out. And so part of it for me is if we can bring the Democrats back towards the middle, my hope is we can get Republicans there. And the other thing,
that's the bet here, right? Is that,
and Jordan, just one thing that I've wanted to talk to you about this for a minute, which is, we talk about moderates and we talk about moderates and more extremes. And the distinction I make, it's like in psychology between process and content in a way. Like my politics are actually probably significantly more progressive than where I live to negotiate and understand that within a system of governance, no one gets everything they want. And we need imperfect incremental progress where everybody takes less of what they want. And so I think that there's an aspect where we can talk about moderate in process. Like, I don't care how extreme within reasonableness, like AOC holding her views, I don't view that as some moral issue if she was more willing to engage on more fair terms about them. Like, I feel like we as a party could sustain a democratic socialist weighing in once in a while from a deep blue district to hold us to account for ways that maybe we would get too tangled up in corruption. It's all about the ability to engage properly, and then people's politics can be wherever they are.
Well, that is essentially the subordination of ideology to the Constitution in some sense, right? Is that regardless of your stated goal and regardless of your ideological position, you swear to abide by the process rules.
Right.
Yeah. Well,
and it all gets so
that
tricky.
Makes you a moderate. That's reasonable, or that makes you a kind of moderate, and it's a reasonable. Okay, I wanted to ask you too. So I know that the fact that you did this and the fact that it was successful, at least as a project, let's say, and probably because of its consequences, but certainly as a project because it's been going on for 4 years and manifested itself on a pretty large scale. What were the consequences for you personally, psychologically? What did this do to you? How did it change you?
Wow. It was one of the best and worst things I ever went through in my life. I feel like it was like going to college for 4 years. I don't have a belief that we can. So I was in large part engaged in the info wars, especially and acutely the last 7 months, because I was on viewing sort of people who are online are largely radicalized and weaponized. And I don't mean that flippantly. I mean that some of the playbooks that are issued by the extremes politically are the ISIS playbook. A lot of the opinions that we believe that we hold are out of troll farms in St. Petersburg. So we're here as a country when that $50 trillion is moving to the top 1%. We actually believe that we're personally damaged if a black man kneels on the sidelines of an NFL game to peacefully protest, or a white girl gets dreadlocks at Yale. Like, the things that we come to believe are these giant stakes, to me, are all the distraction games for the movement of that $50 trillion to the 1%. Because we're not talking about the prison industrial complex, right? We're not talking about the real stuff. And as we're fighting about this, all that keeps happening. So there is a view of the level of corruption, intricacy, difficulty that's dizzying. being in there and online, I'm not sure that somebody can live any substantial portion of their life online and social media and not be insane.
Oh, well, it's like most of what I've encountered online, or a huge proportion of it, has been intensely positive, but even too positive, I would say. Is like so many people comment in the comment section, say on YouTube, that being exposed to my work, and it's based on the ideas of other people. Like, it's not my work, exactly, because no one's work is their work exactly, but being exposed to these ideas, which I've been communicating, let's say, has so positively changed their lives. But to hear that from thousands of people is just, it's overwhelming. Like, that's the positive side of it. It's too bloody much. You get amplified too much. And the negative side is just deadly. Like, on my YouTube channel, the positive to negative comment ratio is about 100-1, and that's about as good as you could ever hope for. But the positive ones are overwhelming, and the negative ones are deadly. And you see this because people will get attacked by 20 people on Twitter, and they'll go into convulsions to apologize. And if you put yourself in the center of this monstrosity, that's multiplied by thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. And it's
not real. It's not real. That's what's so crazy. It's not your family and your community. You don't know what cross-section that is. You don't know, like, if you're at high school and there's one table of mean kids screaming in a corner of a cafe or gossiping.
It's real, but it's impossible to parameterize. When it's your family or your immediate community, these people and you can put some walls around it.
You can't give it the proper weight.
No, that's what I mean. You can't give it the proper weight. You don't know it's because we're not adapted to this environment. It's like,
and so here we have our kids, who I'm increasingly worried about, who it's like trying to exist and go through puberty and go and enter the academic world and the world of culture and ideas while being constantly blared at with the stream of the most salacious, upsetting, and activating gossip that's been algorithmically selected to target you. And that's how politics is. That's what we're dealing with. Now, I was in there, and the thing is, for me, is I talk to anybody. I mean, that. I'll talk to, for a variety of reasons. And one, there's all the obvious reasons for free speech and talking to people who don't agree with you, but also it's like, what are my blind spots? I always want to know. That's hard. It's hard to go in. One time I had a 2-hour conversation with Eric Weinstein, about where he was on everything, but I was right in the middle of it. That takes a while. Eric's incredibly bright. I'm talking to some of the brightest, most impassioned representatives all the way around. That's all the spokes of the wheel that I could get to. And it takes a while.
That's confusing, man.
Yeah. And to find your center and to accommodate and assimilate. And Eric raises a ton of stuff. He pokes at a ton of soft spots. We're friendly. It's a very respectful exchange. But then to come out, incorporate the parts that are right, get clarity on where I think he's skewed for his reasons and his info tunnel that's different from my info tunnel. And I was doing it in every direction. And so it felt like being torn apart to hold the center because I was just being torn every which way.
Well, it gives me more understanding even of why people will settle into their ideological bubble.
Oh, so much easier.
Well, it's a relief. It's such a relief, because you got to ask yourself, just how many questions do you want to ask yourself?
Right.
And I've always thought that exploration in the world of ideas is of unlimited value. Although, I have a conservative element, but man, too much of it can tear you apart. Really
you and
can.
I too have that like really, really high openness.
Yeah, that's the danger of high openness.
I felt like for about 6 or 7 months that every day was a deep dive into something that was toxic and skewed to understand it, to try and come back out and put myself together. And by the way, going into it, there was plenty of times you cross someone who wants to destroy you or scream at you or tell you why you're awful.
Or you make an accidental mistake. Like when we were discussing this a couple of years ago, I swiped one of your videos, if you remember, and put a voiceover over it. And, I thought that was warranted. I mean, in retrospect, I did it without sufficient consideration. And I mean, I realized that very rapidly. I did a voiceover of one of the videos that you'd produced because, well, I thought I had something to say about it. And I was irritated about, well, I was irritated. We'll leave it at that. And that was a big mistake. And that caused a tremendous amount of friction between the two of us. And, you know, and it was also exposed to, I don't know, 100,000 people before I finally took it down. I didn't take it down exactly, but I modified it. But when you're connected in some high intensity fashion, your mistakes are exaggerated to a point that's just intolerable, you know. And again, it's not something that we're adapted to understanding it. Make a mistake and a million people watch it. It's like, it's the sort of thing that can paralyze you into inaction. It's too much.
That's right. And the thing is there's also, like I was talking about, that there's no way to have a perfect conversation about race, class, and gender. There was no way for me to do this. When I first was trying to get Democrats to go on, you, Rogan, you know, Dave, Ben Shapiro, right? And I had some success. I got Stanley McChrystal. I helped go to talk to Ben.
And to me.
I think Sam Harris had Michael Bennett on, but people were really tentative and afraid. And so the only way for me to do it was for me to go on a lot of these first. Well, I was a novelist. I wasn't interested in all of a sudden being put out there on the ledge necessarily in that fashion, especially for the communities that I'm in, especially as a liberal, right? In the communities that I'm in. Yeah. But I had to be sort of the case study for it. And, you know, I did it. But what's funny is if I look back at that, there's 100 things I would say or do differently. There's no way to do that without.
Well, and nobody's an expert at it. It's like, if you want to move politically, you're going to do it badly, especially to begin with. So
that's right. And we don't. And this is one of the things that's troubled me a lot about, you know, so to answer your question, at the end of this, I was not in good shape for reasons you and I can get into later over bourbon in more depth.
I think I'll stick to sparkling water given the state of my nervous system.
Sparkling water and salted meat. I'll drink enough bourbon for both of us. But, you know, part of that process was, I don't know. It's like it's so much to go into. It's so much to dive down to really try to figure it out, to really be open to what all those blind spots are. Yeah. And to come at feeling like you're still intact. And I had to race to make mistakes. We spun up this whole operation. I mean, it doesn't even make any sense if I look back on it, the amount of stuff we got done. You're racing to make mistakes. You have that one lecture, The Fool Precedes the Master. And it was like, how quickly can I be a fool on how many fronts the most rapidly as possible to try and just get better? I mean, we spun up an entire, you know, studio operation, fundraising, distribution, dissemination, network. I mean, it was crazy.
Well, and then what was hard on you was what? The rate, the intensity, the exposure to all the different opinions, the consequences of making a mistake.
The consequences of making a mistake. Like let's say my theory of the case had been wrong and it should have been a further left thing and Biden wasn't the guy and all this other stuff. And we'd lost because I call it that figure, which again, I'm saying is slightly overblown. If I targeted $1 billion in advertising to the wrong people, giving the wrong message, and blew the mark, and we lost the election by 104,000 votes instead of winning it by 104,000 votes, that's a lot to live with. And I didn't even consider that till I was so far in that there kind of wasn't going out. I mean, you can't consider everything as you go. But the other thing is I saw with more and more clarity, I got way too much, not too much. I had a ton of information constantly, daily, hourly about my blind spots and confirmation biases. And a lot of anger and
a lot of those things, the upside of a lot of those things, your blind spots, your confirmation biases, your prejudices, all those things is they protect you from being overwhelmed. Like they're compression algorithms and they remove information, hordes of it. And a lot of that information is valuable, but Jesus, it's like, how much information can you swallow?
I mean, that's right. And what was really, and the only way that I determined to make headway in something that complex and that corrupt, and I don't mean entirely corrupt, but I mean, politics, and with that much anger and rage and outrage and frustration and pain and grief, like was to try and go forth as cleanly as possible. And no one can do that.
I tried the same thing, because I was dealing with people's psychological problems and trying to step very carefully to not make a mistake. But man,
you're gonna, there's no not failing if you're doing that all day, every day with those stakes multiple times a day, and that'll eat you up. And part of what happened for me that was so funny, I had two things that were funny, which you'll be particularly amused at. But so I got to the end of this and I was really seeing things only in moral terms. And what was interesting is at the end of this, after the week after the election I was pretty dysregulated, let's just say. Most of the conversations I had were with my conservative friends. I called my born again Christian friends. I called my Navy SEALs buddies, because I was seeing everything in like mythological good and evil sort of terms. And it's like, what was so funny was at the end of this exercise for liberalism, right? For moving towards Enlightenment discourse, moving towards a Democratic Party that I thought was less imperfect, significantly less imperfect than the imperfections of the Republican Party as it stands under Trump, was for me to need a lot of support from my conservative friends. And fortunately, I have that.
What kind of support did you get? Like, and why was it necessary to seek it out from those sources?
If you talk a lot about mythology, the 7 deadly sins, right? If that's what you're conscious of and seeing, right? Because at a certain point, there's so much information and you're so open that you're just dealing constantly with your own failings, right? And you're seeing others and you're trying to clean them up, and it's almost like I got stripped down to the bone. I don't have the sort of the particular courage and drive of my friends who are SEALs who are in the military, but this felt like it was my version of confronting things psychologically, that in the way that I could, from a position of much more relative safety, where I was getting torn apart and trying to put back together. And conservatives they understood that better. And if I start to talk about that in ways, it's part of why I have such a wheelhouse of friends, is like, it all comes very genuinely, but also it's strategy, it's like, you need people who think. That's an interesting observation, because, you could make the claim that just as the world needs an array of political viewpoints, the full array of political viewpoints, barring corruption, let's say, you need to surround yourself with a full array of personalities, from conservative to liberal, because that way the bases are covered and different situations are going to call for different people. Thank God there are different people. And actually, that's a good way to end this, is like, thank God there are different people, because no one can do everything all the time. And so we specialize, and that's true in the political realm as well. And we need to understand that and not assume that the conservatives are right or the liberals are right, but to understand that each of them is right now and then. Well, and the thing is that's also such an interesting part. You brought up that disagreement that you and I had that was pretty intense, but we worked it out, and I knew we'd work it out, and you knew we'd work it out.
Yeah, it shorted me right out. Partly because I was tearing myself apart about being impulsive, and also partly because of the magnitude of the mistake, the public nature of the mistake, let's say, and clearly because it also.
I feel like when we went through that, we knew we would get through it. We just knew it would be rocky in a way. And what was interesting is what I found was some of the people most adept at pointing out my blind spots, when I then was in free fall as a result of being subjected to how many blind spots I had, of course, they'd be the ones who would be able to orient me, right? Because they're the ones who could see those things. Mm-hmm. So, right. So that's part of the thing too, why part of that was in that week where I was the most acutely flailing, let's say, of course, I'm going to go to the people who were the ones who had the most views that made me think about things, because I was like, I feel lost and spun. I'm not going to talk to people whose views I feel like that's a home base for me, because I'm not on my home base. I need different kind of input, And I think the same is true vice versa.
So you've pulled back. What happens now, Gregg? What's like, you've graduated from your new college, let's say. And so that's a tremendous relief, like it is when you graduate from anything, when you accomplish something or when you're finished with something, but it's also leaves a huge hole. You are obviously going to concentrate on your writing again. You have a new book coming out in January. What's the name of that book?
Prodigal Son.
And your last book?
The one that came out previous is Into the Fire. So what's happened that's so amazing with this, I had a talk with a mutual friend of ours a while ago talking about this. And I was like, for me, one of the things that's been so amazing is the amount that I've learned and the confluence with the series that I'm writing now with the Orphan X and what he's doing. It's like bizarre levels of synchronicity with it. And so it's funny because I'm coming out and going right into a draft of a new novel. Right.
Well, you know so much more. I mean, I've watched you over the last 4 years. You know so much more about the way things work than you did before, that's got to have nothing but a beneficial effect on your ability to spin up stories.
Well, and to try to address them in that way where it's easier, and this is always why I started, I don't want to write and make propaganda, right? This was a sort of necessity and it felt a bit like a call to duty, but I want to write and have people think through formats that are one step removed, through science fiction, right? Through the thrillers, through Orphan X. And it's been really gratifying, as that series has built, that some of it's in there. But so I'm having a renewed love affair with that. It was a little hard to take my hands off the steering wheel with the politics. And I'm sure that feeling like when I was going so hard so long that part of it was like, well, I should be involved with these 50 things, but I've narrowed the scope. I have a few pet projects. I want to keep working in terms of discussions with the evangelical community and doing across the aisle. The anti-polarization stuff is really
I really like, we did some of that in Washington when we were bringing Republicans and Democrats, congressmen and senators as well. I believe I was really unhappy when I couldn't do that anymore because that was so worthwhile and the opportunity is still sitting there. And so hopefully my health will hold. I'd love to do that again. It's such gratifying work.
We should. And I think what's funny with that is it's like, here you and I are all tangled up in different political discussions in different ways, but neither of us were particularly political, really. It's like that never was the source or drive.
Yeah, well, I always made a decision. I've had to make a decision between politics and other routes continually in my life, and I always picked the alternative routes.
Yeah, me too.
So, all right. Well, we should wrap this up, I guess.
Yep.
We've covered a lot of ground. It was really good talking to you.
Great talking to you too, Jordan. We'll talk soon.